The morning he swung that front door open, the smirk on his face was something I'll never forget. He had that look people get when they've already won, or think they have. His mother was right behind him, chin lifted, arms crossed over her chest like she was inspecting a property she'd just purchased. And next to him stood Deanna, her hand looped through his elbow, wearing my ex-husband's old college hoodie like it was a trophy she'd earned. 3 days. It had been exactly 3 days since the judge signed the papers. 3 days since I'd sat in a gray-carpeted office in the county courthouse, signed my name on a line, and walked out into the cold October air, feeling like I'd finally exhaled after years of holding my breath. Then, the door swung open, and every single smile on their faces vanished. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that moment mattered, why I nearly laughed out loud right there in my own living room, you have to understand how I got there. How a 28-year-old seamstress from a nowhere little town in rural Tennessee ended up fighting for the house she'd poured every last dollar and callus into. And you have to understand the man I married, and the neighbor upstairs who set the whole thing in motion. I grew up in Clover Hollow. If you've never heard of it, that's because there's nothing to hear. It's the kind of place where the Dollar General is considered a shopping destination, and everybody knows your car by the sound of the engine. Population 1,200, give or take whoever left for college and didn't come back. I stayed, not because I had no ambition, but because I genuinely loved it. The tobacco-colored light in October, the way the hills went rust and amber all at once, the slowness of things. I had my sewing work, my little house, my 2 cats, Moth and Sable. Moth was a pale gray tabby who acted like she owned every surface in the room. Sable was all black, nervous, and attached to me like a shadow. Between the 2 of them and a steady stream of alterations, bridal work, and custom orders, I had built something quiet and mine. Then I met Garrett Cole. He was from the next county over, which in Clover Hollow might as well be international. He'd come down to visit his cousin, ended up at a bonfire behind the Massey farm, and somehow ended up talking to me for 3 hours about nothing in particular. He had this way of listening that felt rare, tilting his whole body toward you, like whatever you were saying was the only thing worth hearing. I was 22. I fell hard and fast, the way you do when you're young, and haven't yet learned that good listening isn't the same as good character. We got married the following spring. Not in October, May actually, at the Little Baptist Church on Route 9, with wildflowers from my aunt's yard stuffed into mason jars. My mom cried. His mom, Roberta, did not. She sat in the front pew with her reading glasses on top of her head and watched the whole thing like she was auditing a business meeting. I told myself she was just nervous. I told myself a lot of things in those early years. We moved into my house, technically the house I'd inherited from my grandmother 2 years before the wedding. A 2-bedroom, 1-bath white clapboard on the edge of town, with a deep front porch and a sewing room I'd built out of the 2nd bedroom with my own hands. I'd installed the shelving myself. I'd sanded those floors twice. I had the deed in my name, had paid the property taxes every year without fail, had replaced the water heater the winter before we got married, because I refused to go into a marriage with a failing appliance. The house was mine in every way that mattered, legally, emotionally, physically. Garrett worked in equipment sales, drove a lot, was gone Monday through Thursday most weeks. The arrangement suited him and, for a while, it suited me. I had my rhythm. Up early, coffee, an hour of hand-stitching before the cats demanded breakfast. Orders came in through my website and by word of mouth. I did prom dresses, wedding alterations, Halloween costumes that parents wanted done right. I wasn't getting rich, but I was paying my half of everything and building a small savings account I didn't talk about, because Garrett had a habit of having ideas about money that didn't pan out. The first 4 years, if I'm honest, were fine. Not spectacular. Fine. There were good stretches, road trips, lazy Sundays, a Thanksgiving where his whole family came, and even Roberta seemed to relax after her 2nd glass of wine. There were hard stretches, too. The fights about money, about his travel schedule, about the way he'd agree to things and then simply not do them. but nothing that felt unfixable, nothing that felt like a sign. Then, about a year before everything fell apart, a man named Dale Pruitt moved into the apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, 2 blocks from my house. This is relevant. This is, in fact, the detail that unraveled everything, though I didn't know it at the time. Dale was in his mid-40s, recently divorced himself, with the kind of face that looked permanently aggrieved, like the world owed him something and was late on payments. He and Garrett met at the gas station and started talking, the way men in small towns do, and within a month they were going to the same bar on Friday nights. I didn't think much of it. Garrett needed social outlets. I had my work, he needed his friends. Fine. What I didn't know, what I found out in pieces later, the way you find out things that have been deliberately hidden from you, was that Dale had been working on Garrett for months. Not with anything dramatic at first, just conversation, just slow, patient pressure. Dale had lost his house in his divorce, and he was bitter about it, in that specific way that looks for someone to agree with it. Garrett was, it turned out, an easy audience. But the thing that really started cracking the foundation of my marriage wasn't Dale's bitterness or Garrett's susceptibility to it. It was something that happened on a Tuesday night in mid-September, about 6 weeks before the divorce filing. I was in the sewing room, finishing a bridesmaid dress order that was due Friday, moth curled on top of the cutting table like a paperweight with opinions. Garrett called from the road. He was in Knoxville, supposed to be home the next day. "Hey," he said. "So Dale's been having a rough time." "Okay," I said, keeping my eyes on the seam I was pressing. "His landlord's raising his rent, like, significantly. He might have to move." "That's rough," I said. A pause, long enough that I looked up from the fabric. "I told him he could maybe stay in the spare room for a bit," Garrett said, "just until he figures something out." I set the iron down. "You told him that without asking me first." "I was going to ask you. I'm asking you now." "You said, 'I told him.' That's not asking." "Nadia, it would only be for a few weeks. The guy is struggling." "My name is Nadia. Nadia Colton, back to my maiden name now, but Nadia Cole for 5 years. 5 years of marriage, and he had gotten so comfortable with my house, my space, my sewing room, my porch, my grandmother's kitchen tiles, that he'd started making decisions about them without a second thought. I said no, firmly and clearly. Dale would not be staying in my house, and Garrett went quiet in that way he had, not angry exactly, but recalibrating, filing the no away somewhere. That should have been my first real warning. Instead, I pressed the bridesmaid dress, finished the order, and let Moth knock a spool of thread off the table, while I convinced myself it was just a small disagreement. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I found out Dale Pruitt had not actually been struggling with his rent. As I learned afterward from Garrett's cousin Tammy, who had a loose tongue and a good heart in roughly equal measure, Dale had moved in with a woman named Deanna the month before. He had a place to stay. He'd been completely fine. The whole thing had been a test. Garrett had been testing me. And that was when I started paying closer attention to everything. The leaves outside my sewing room window had gone full amber by then, that particular golden hour shade of Tennessee October that usually made me feel like everything was going to be all right. That year, it just made me feel like something beautiful was about to fall. I was right. I started keeping a notebook. Not a journal, exactly. I wasn't the type to write down my feelings before bed. It was more like a log. A small green spiral notebook I kept in the bottom drawer of my sewing table, underneath a bolt of ivory charmeuse. Dates, times, things I noticed. The Tuesday, Garrett came home early and smelled like a different brand of soap. The Thursday, he took a call outside on the porch and came back in without explaining who it was. The Saturday, his phone kept lighting up face down on the kitchen counter while he pretended to watch the game. Small things. The kind of things a paranoid person notices and a rational person dismisses. I kept writing them down anyway. By November, the notebook had 14 pages. I want to be honest about that period, because I think people assume that when you're figuring out your marriage is falling apart, you're in some heightened state of drama, crying in the shower, confronting people, making big speeches. The truth is duller and worse than that. I just kept working. I took an enormous custom order for a mother-of-the-bride gown in dusty rose silk, the kind of painstaking work that requires complete concentration, and I poured myself into it. Moth sat on the radiator. Sable slept under my cutting table. I stitched and pressed and stitched again, and outside the window the hills went gray and bare, the way they do in East Tennessee by mid-November, and I felt like I was disappearing into the background of my own life. Garrett was home less. When he was home, he was somewhere else in his head. I asked once, just once, directly, if there was someone else. He looked at me with this expression I can only describe as practiced, calm, almost rehearsed. "Nadia," he said, "you're doing that thing again where you look for problems." "What thing?" I said. "Where everything's fine and you convince yourself it isn't." He said it gently, like he was being patient with me, like I was a child who kept seeing monsters in the closet. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I went back to my sewing room and wrote the date in the notebook and the words, "He deflected, didn't deny." 3 weeks later, I found out about Deanna. Not dramatically. Not by catching them together or finding a text message. I found out because Tammy, Garrett's cousin, the one with the loose tongue, called me on a Wednesday afternoon while I was driving back from dropping off the dusty rose gown. She didn't mean to tell me. She thought I already knew, which is somehow the worst version of finding out. She mentioned Deanna in passing, said something about how she'd seen them at a bar over in Greenville, said she'd felt awkward about it. Then she heard my silence and said, "Oh, honey, you didn't know." I pulled into the Dollar General parking lot and sat there for 45 minutes with the engine running. I didn't cry. I'm not saying that to sound tough. I just couldn't. It was like the information was too large to process all at once, so my body just went completely still. I stared at the Dollar General sign and thought, so that's what it was. Not paranoia, not inventing problems, not the thing Garrett had been training me to believe I was doing for months. I drove home. I fed the cats. I opened the notebook and wrote Deanna's name. The divorce filing took 3 months from that Wednesday in the Dollar General parking lot. I want to be accurate about that timeline because people always assume it happens faster or slower than it does. I found a divorce attorney in Knoxville, a woman named Cecile Marsh, who was small and unhurried and had the kind of stillness that made you feel like she'd seen everything and nothing could surprise her anymore. My first appointment was in early December. I sat across from her desk with the notebook in my lap, and I told her everything. She listened. When I finished, she put her pen down and asked me one question. "Is the house in your name alone?" "Yes," I said. "It was my grandmother's. I inherited it before the marriage. The deed has only ever been in my name." Something shifted in her expression, not relief exactly, more like the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle piece fitting correctly. "Good," she said. "That's very good." She explained what that meant in plain language. In Tennessee, property inherited before a marriage is considered separate property, not marital property, as long as it hasn't been commingled, meaning as long as marital funds haven't been used to substantially improve it, or as long as both names haven't been added to the deed. I had never added Garrett's name. I had replaced the water heater with my own savings before we married. The one significant repair during the marriage, a new roof, 2 years in, had been paid for by an insurance claim from storm damage, not from joint funds. "He has no legal claim to the house," Cecile said, "not as separate inherited property with your sole name on the deed and no commingling of marital assets." I exhaled, long and slow, like I'd been holding it for months. "He's going to be angry about that," I said. "They usually are," she said. What I didn't fully account for, what Cecile warned me about but I underestimated, was Roberta. Garrett's mother had an opinion about everything, had never fully accepted that the house was mine and not ours, and had spent 5 years making small comments that I'd absorbed and filed away without examining. Things like, "When you two eventually upgrade, or you'll want more space once you have kids," as if the house were a temporary situation rather than my home, as if it were always just a stepping stone to something Garrett would eventually provide. I'd let those comments slide because fighting every small thing is exhausting, and I'd told myself she was just old-fashioned. What I didn't know until Tammy told me, in the same phone call where she confirmed Deanna's last name was Pruitt, yes, as in Dale Pruitt's younger sister, which explained more than I wanted to think about, was that Roberta had already been talking. She'd been telling people in the family that once the divorce was settled, Garrett would be moving back into his house with his new partner. She'd said it at Christmas, apparently, in front of multiple family members, like it was decided. His house. I sat with that phrase for a long time. It was Tammy who told me one more thing, the thing that moved me from grieving to genuinely scared. She called again in late January, and her voice was different this time, quieter, careful. "Nadia, I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said, "but Garrett's been talking to Dale about the property, about whether there's any way to contest the deed. Dale's been doing research, apparently, looking stuff up online." She paused. "He's convinced Garrett there might be something there. I don't know. I just thought you should know." I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at my sewing table in the dark for a while with Sable in my lap, just breathing. Then I called Cecile. She was unruffled, which was exactly what I needed. She told me that internet research by a bitter man with no legal background was not a threat to a clear deed and a documented inheritance. She told me the case was straightforward. She told me to stop worrying. But she also said something I didn't expect. "Change your locks." "The divorce isn't final yet," I said. "I know, but you have sole ownership of that property. You have every right to control access to it. If things get contentious, you want to document that you took reasonable steps to secure your home." She paused. "Has he made any statements about what he plans to do after the divorce?" I thought about Roberta at Christmas, about his house. "Yes," I said. "Then change your locks," Cecile said again, "this week." I changed them the next morning. A locksmith from the next town over, a man named Roy who didn't ask questions, and charged me $180 cash. New deadbolts, front and back, new keyed knob on the side door by the sewing room, 3 new keys cut, one for me, one I kept in my car, one I put in a small envelope and mailed to Cecile's office. Garrett found out when he came to collect more of his things, and his key didn't work. He called me 3 times in 20 minutes. I let them go to voicemail. His voice went from confused to irritated to something that scared me a little, this low, controlled anger that I'd heard before but always assumed was about something else. "Nadia, this is not your house alone. We built a life here. You don't just get to lock me out of our life." I played that voicemail twice. Then I sent it to Cecile. She forwarded it to the opposing counsel with a note I never saw, but that Tammy later told me had made Garrett go completely white when his own attorney read it to him. The divorce was finalized on a cold Wednesday in late March. Not October, not the poetic autumn I might have written if I were making this up. March, gray and damp, the hills outside the courthouse still bare and muddy, forsythia just barely starting to think about blooming. I signed my name in a gray-carpeted office and walked out into the cold air, feeling like I'd finally exhaled after years of holding my breath. I drove home. I unlocked my door, my lock, my key. Moth was on the back of the couch. Sable came out from under the bed, which she only did for me. I thought it was over. I was wrong by exactly 3 days, because on the 3rd morning after the divorce was finalized, I heard tires on my gravel drive. Multiple cars. I looked out the sewing room window and saw Garrett's truck, and behind it, Roberta's silver sedan, and behind that, a car I didn't recognize, a dark blue Civic with a cracked rear bumper. I stood at the window and watched them get out. Garrett, Roberta, and a woman in my ex-husband's old college hoodie, her hand through his elbow, looking at my front porch like she was already deciding where to put the furniture. My stomach dropped. Then it lifted, because I'd known this was coming. I'd known since January, since Tammy's second phone call, since the voicemail Cecile had forwarded. I hadn't just been waiting, I had been preparing. And everything they were about to walk into, every document, every lock, every phone call I'd made in the dark while Sable sat in my lap and the hills outside went gray and bare, was already in place. I watched Garrett reach into his jacket pocket for a key that no longer worked. I picked up my phone. And called Cecile. She answered on the second ring, which told me she'd been expecting this. I'd warned her the week before, told her what Tammy had said, told her about Roberta's Christmas announcement, told her I had a feeling it wouldn't end clean. Cecile had told me to call her the moment anything happened. "They're in my driveway," I said. "Garrett, Roberta, and Deanna. 3 cars." "Don't open the door," she said immediately. "Don't engage, don't argue, don't let them inside. Is there anything of his still in the house?" "No, he took everything in February, in 2 separate trips. I have the dated photos." "Good. Call the sheriff's non-emergency line right now. Tell them your ex-husband is attempting to enter your property without permission, following a finalized divorce. Give them the case number. I'm going to text it to you in 30 seconds. A pause, then. "And Nadia, stay calm. You have everything you need." The text came through with the case number before I'd even lowered the phone from my ear. I watched through the sewing room window as Garrett tried the key. He tried it twice, once in the deadbolt, once in the knob, with this increasingly confused expression, like the lock was the one making a mistake. Then he pulled back and looked at the key, then at the door, then at Roberta. She said something I couldn't hear. Deanna stood 2 steps behind them on the porch, still with her hand on his arm, her face starting to rearrange itself from the bright, proprietary smile she'd arrived with into something more cautious. I called the non-emergency line. The dispatcher was calm and thorough. I gave her the case number, the address, the situation. She said a deputy would be out within 20 minutes. Then I walked to my front door and opened it. Not wide. I stood in the doorframe, my house, my grandmother's white clapboard, and I looked at the 3 of them on my porch. Garrett's jaw was tight. Roberta had her reading glasses pushed up on her head the way she always did when she was about to manage a situation. Deanna took a small step backward when she saw me, which I noted and did not comment on. "Nadia," Garrett said. He said my name like it was a negotiating position. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," I said. "The divorce was finalized 3 days ago. You have no legal claim to this property. You're trespassing." "This is our home," Roberta said, and the way she said it, our home, with this absolute conviction, like she'd been saying it to herself for so long that it had become true in her mind, made something cold settle in my chest. "No," I said, "it isn't. It's my home. It was my grandmother's home. Garrett's name has never been on the deed. Cecile Marsh's office has a complete copy of the title history if you'd like to review it." "You can't just," Garrett started. "I changed the locks in January," I said. "That was legal. I have sole ownership of this property, documented through an inheritance that predates our marriage. The divorce decree, which you signed, does not grant you any claim to this house. The judge agreed. Your attorney agreed. There is nothing to discuss." Garrett's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, anger, something that looked briefly like embarrassment before it hardened back into anger. "You planned this," he said. It came out low, almost quiet. "You've been planning this the whole time." "I've been protecting what's mine," I said. "There's a difference." Roberta made a sound, not quite a word, more like the beginning of one that she reconsidered. She looked at Deanna. Deanna was looking at the porch boards. The college hoodie, Garrett's old Tennessee Vol orange, looked different now than it had in the driveway, less like a trophy, more like something she'd borrowed and now wasn't sure how to return. "The sheriff is on the way," I said. "I called them before I opened the door. If you leave now, there's no incident on record. If you stay, there is. That's the only decision you have to make right now." The silence that followed was the longest 15 seconds I've experienced. I heard a crow somewhere down the road. I heard Sable knock something off the cutting table in the back room, a spool, probably, her usual method of protest when strangers were near. Garrett looked at me. I looked back. I don't know what he was searching for, contrition maybe, or wavering, or some version of the woman he'd spent 5 years convincing herself she was inventing problems. He didn't find it. He turned and walked down the porch steps. Roberta followed him, her chin still lifted but something gone out of her posture, some certainty deflated. Deanna went last, quickly, without looking at me. The deputy arrived 7 minutes later, while all three of them were still sitting in their cars at the end of my driveway, apparently unable to agree on what to do next. His name was Deputy Harlan Fitch, mid-40s, unhurried, the kind of law enforcement presence that makes a situation feel very real very fast. I showed him the divorce decree, the deed, Cecile's letter confirming sole ownership. He reviewed it all with the same quiet attention that Cecile had shown in her office in December. Then he walked down the driveway. I didn't watch what happened next. I went back inside. I sat down at my sewing table, and Sable climbed immediately into my lap, which she did precisely twice a day under normal circumstances, and more often when she could tell something was wrong. I put my hand on her back and felt her breathing slow mine down. I heard one car leave, then a second, then a third. Deputy Fitch knocked on my front door about 10 minutes later to let me know they'd gone. He said Garrett had been informed that any further attempt to enter the property without my permission would constitute criminal trespass, and that the encounter had been logged. He handed me a card with the report number on it. I thanked him. He nodded, the way people do when they've seen a situation handled correctly and are glad not to have had to do more. After he left, I called Cecile and told her what happened. "Good," she said, in that unhurried way she had. "The log matters. Keep the deputy's card, and if he contacts you, calls, texts, shows up again, document it and call me immediately." He didn't show up again. He texted once, 2 days later, a long message I read twice, and then forwarded to Cecile without responding. It was the kind of message that wanted to reframe everything that had happened as my fault, my planning, my coldness. I'd been expecting something like it. Cecile added it to the file. What I hadn't expected was Roberta. She called me 10 days after the driveway incident. I almost didn't answer. I almost let it go to voicemail and sent it to Cecile like everything else. But something made me pick up. Curiosity, maybe, or the fact that I'd spent 5 years being managed by this woman, and I wanted, just once, to be the one who chose the terms of the conversation. "Nadia," she said. Her voice was different. Not the chin-lifted certainty of the porch. Something underneath it had shifted. "Roberta," I said. A pause. "I owe you an apology," she said. I didn't say anything. I waited. I said things, to the family, about the house, about what would happen after. Another pause, and I heard her take a breath. "I was wrong. About the house, and about other things. I want you to know that." I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the 5 years of small comments. When you two eventually upgrade, you'll want more space. I thought about his house, set at Christmas in front of people who believed her. I thought about how much easier the last 5 years might have been if this woman had simply acknowledged, even once, that I had built something real and that it was mine. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, and I meant it. Not as forgiveness exactly, but as acknowledgement. It cost her something to make that call. I wasn't going to pretend it didn't. We didn't talk long. There wasn't much more to say. After I hung up, I sat at my sewing table and looked out the window at the hills, which had started to go green again in the tentative way they do in early April in East Tennessee. The forsythia by the back fence was finally blooming, late but determined. The months that followed were quieter than I expected, quieter and more fully mine. I finished a backlog of orders I'd let slip during the worst of the divorce proceedings. A prom dress in emerald green, a set of curtains for a woman in the next town who'd been waiting patiently since January, a bridal assertion that needed 3 separate fittings and a complete reconstruction of the bodice, which I loved because it required every bit of my concentration and left no room for anything else. Tammy called in May to tell me that Garrett and Deanna had moved into an apartment in Greenville. I thanked her for letting me know and didn't ask anything further. Whatever happened next in Garrett's life was genuinely not my concern. That felt strange at first, and then it felt like putting down something heavy I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I got the water heater inspected in June because it was 6 years old and I believed in maintenance. I repainted the front porch railing in late July, the same white it had always been, because I liked it that way. Moth spent the entire painting project supervising from the porch swing, with the expression of someone who had opinions about the color choice, but was choosing not to share them. Sable stayed inside and watched through the screen door. I didn't start dating again for a long time. That wasn't loneliness or defeat. It was just that I had a life to rebuild into something that was entirely, unapologetically mine. And that work was interesting enough on its own. I started taking on larger, custom projects, the kind I'd always wanted to do but hadn't, because Garrett's schedule and moods had a way of contracting whatever space I tried to expand into. I drove to Nashville twice to meet with a boutique that wanted to carry some of my work. The second meeting ended with a contract. It was small, 12 pieces to start, but it was real, and I drove home on the interstate with the windows down and the radio loud, and the hills going amber in the late afternoon light. A year after the divorce was finalized, I had the deed to my house framed. Not the original, a certified copy, because I kept the original in a fireproof box under the bed, but a clean copy, with the title history and my grandmother's name and then my name and no one else's, ever. I hung it in the sewing room, above the shelves I'd built and below the window that looked out on the hills. Moth ignored it completely. Sable sniffed the frame once and then went back to her spot under the cutting table. I looked at it for a while, standing in the middle of the room I'd built with my own hands. In the house my grandmother had left me, in the town where I'd been born and chosen to stay. The October light came through the window the way it always did, tobacco gold, amber, that particular quality of Tennessee autumn that used to make me feel like everything was going to be all right. This time, I didn't just feel it, I knew it. Some things you inherit, some things you build. The hardest lesson I learned in those years wasn't about Garrett, or Roberta, or Deanna in her borrowed hoodie standing on my porch. The hardest lesson was that you can spend years making yourself smaller to fit inside someone else's version of your life, and then one day you change the locks and you find out the whole house was always yours.